I would like to thank everyone for switching on today and wanting to learn more about our plan to protect the very rare and endangered Livingstone's flying fox on the Comoros. So like Karen said, I am an Endangered Species Intervention Fellow. I'm currently based at the University of Vienna and working for Bat Conservation International and with our local partners, Sahari, to protect this bat on Comoros. Livingstone flying foxes are quite unique bats. First of all, they're gorgeous to look at. I really enjoy this black fur, the round ears, their puppy dog eyes, but also they're one of the largest bats that we have in the world. So they have a wingspan of around 4.5 feet when they're fully grown, which is quite big. They are flying foxes, so their diet is mainly fruit, probably also nectar and flowers. Unfortunately, we don't know exactly what fruit or which fruits these bats eat because we don't really know a lot about their diet. But flying foxes are generally considered keystone species. And what that means is that many plants actually depend on these bats for their reproduction. So flying foxes will be responsible for pollinating some specific plants and also for dispersing the seeds. And because Livingstone's flying foxes are the largest native mammal on the Comoros, it's very likely that they also are keystone species there. So there will be a few plants on the Comoros that depend on the bats for their reproduction. Like I mentioned, the Livingstone's flying fox occurs only on the Comoros. So those are tiny islands in the Indian Ocean. And their natural habitat is rainforest. And these bats are incredibly rare right now. So we have around 1,200 bats left in the wild. And because of that, the small population size, and because of their habitat is really under threat, we'll hear about that a bit more, these bats are currently classed as critically endangered by the IUCN Red List. If you don't know where the Comoros are, don't worry. I didn't know either. I had to Google before I moved there a few years ago. But it's, like I mentioned, a small group of islands in the Indian Ocean, just off the east coast of Africa. So they are between Mozambique and Madagascar. And the three islands that you can see here in red are the Union of Comoros, and together they have a surface area of around 2,000 square kilometers, but we have nearly 1 million people living there. So the population density is incredibly high. The natural habitat is very beautiful. It's montane rainforest, so high elevations, high humidity, beautiful lush greenery. And there's a lot of endemic fauna and flora on these islands. And what that means is that there are many species of animal and plants that you can only find on the Comoros because they originated there. And the Livingstone flying fox is actually one of them. So they're endemic to the Comoros and you can only find them on the island of Anjouan and the island of Moheli. If you go for a walk on Anjouan, you might actually see something like this. But this is a roost tree of the Livingstone's flying fox on the island of Anjouan. The roost sites for bats are incredibly important resources because they use them for rest and socializing. And in the case of the Livingstone's flying foxes, these roost sites are often large trees that are slightly exposed and near or within forested areas or areas where there's still some trees remaining. And the bats normally roost like this, so they roost alone or maybe in pairs. You often find moms and pups together, but there's not a lot of bats per roost site. And these roosts are an incredibly important resource for the bats. And we know of about 20 roost sites across both islands, 15 active ones on the island of Anjouan. And I'll be talking a lot about Anjouan today because this is where the larger part of the population of the Livingstone flying foxes is actually based. So about, 2/3 of the population live on Anjouan, the rest live on Moheli. And this is also a very beautiful area to be on. So like I mentioned, it's lush and green. You have lots of trees, and this is kind of the most pristine type of habitat that you will find on both Moheli and Anjouan, because this is a picture of the national park that's been established on Moheli. So here you have actual rainforest left. So it looks beautiful, and on first glance, you see yourself admiring the forest. But then if you look closer, you can actually see that in the foreground of the picture, you see these leafy plants, and those are banana plants. And banana plants are very often a sure sign that there's actually some agricultural activity in the area. So even in areas where you should have pristine or nearly pristine rainforest, you can find some human activities. And this is particularly pronounced on Anjouan. So if you look at this picture, the top half, you actually see some rainforest trees. So those are original old rainforest trees, and they're actually harboring one of the biggest roosts that we know of on Anjouan. So if you look very closely, it'll probably be difficult to see, but these little black dots on the tree canopy there, those are all bats. And then again, first glance, it's beautifully green, but if you look closer, the trees on the slope leading to this roost site have actually been cut down for the most part and replaced with banana plants. So all these leafy plants that you can see growing there, these are all banana plants. And these are, again, an important crop plant on Anjouan as well. So this is what it looks like in the higher elevations. And when we go even lower down, you can see that nearly all accessible land on Anjouan looks like this. So we have this patchwork of agricultural fields, and you see that most of the trees have actually been cut down in these areas. So the few trees that are left standing are sometimes actually the original rainforest trees, and they are left standing to kind of mark the borders of certain fields. But most of the area, there's no shrubs left, there are no trees left, it's being used for agriculture. And one of the reasons why agricultural activities are so important on Anjouan is because there's very few alternatives to subsistence agriculture. So local population feeds themselves and their family from the land. They need the land to be able to survive. So any conservation action needs to take this into consideration, that you can't just protect the land without thinking of the local population. But on the other hand, it's quite complicated to implement any widespread general conservation actions, because when you see this patchwork, most of these fields belong to individual people. So you have many different people on even a small area already. So any conservation action that you want to implement has to kind of work on a one-on-one basis here. And because of the system of land ownership, actually most of the roost sites on Anjouan are on privately owned land. So they're not in some general forest, they're actually on somebody's field. And that looks pretty similar to this. And it's so important to kind of keep that in mind, that while subsistence agriculture is a big driver of this deforestation, there are also other factors that kind of go into this cutting down of trees. And a big one is the need for wood in furniture and construction and in building ships as well, but also for a landowner who has some large trees on their land. Cutting down a large tree and selling the wood for timber is actually quite a good way of getting lots of fast cash. So those trees are valuable sources of income for farmers and landholders as well. And oftentimes, like I mentioned, they're being used for furniture and construction. And in this case, especially these original old growth rainforest trees are being targeted. So these old native trees that's been there since the original forest, those are valuable wood for furniture and construction, and those are a very important source of income for many landholders. So they're being specifically targeted to be cut down and sold for cash. And unfortunately, like I mentioned before, the Livingstone flying foxes, they also rely on this type of tree for roost trees. So they'll also be targeting these old growth original rainforest trees as roost sites. So this is a very direct threat to the roost sites here on Anjouan. Another one that is more of an indirect threat, but also a big driver of deforestation, is the production of ylang-ylang oil. You might have seen ylang-ylang flowers, those yellow curly flowers on the slide, but I'm sure you've definitely smelled them, because ylang oil is a very, very famous and very widespread scent in skincare products, but also in quite famous perfumes that we have here in the US and in Europe. So ylang oil is an important component of all of these perfumes that are there, and also many skincare products. And actually half of the global production of ylang flowers and ylang oil is produced on the Comoros, on these 3 tiny islands. So about 50 to 65 tons per year are being produced. And as you can imagine, these kind of numbers, these plantations, they need a lot of space. So on this picture here, you can see an ylang plantation. Those are actually trees that are being kept artificially short, so it's easier to harvest the flowers. And they need quite a lot of space. And not only that, but ylang oil is actually being distilled in distilleries that look a little bit like this. So when you drive around Anjouan, just next to the road, you'll see an assortment of big metal kettles and contraptions, and those are roadside distilleries, and they're actually producing these important or these expensive oils that we use in our skincare products. And these distilleries, they run on very old school fire ovens, so they actually require full fuel wood to be able to get them going. So a lot of trees are not only being cut down to make room for plantations, but also to kind of fuel these distilleries to actually extract the oils. So the Comoros as a habitat for flying foxes is momentarily complicated because of this really high deforestation that has impacts not only directly to the roost trees, but on the landscape as a whole. For example, if you cut down all of the trees, there's nothing to hold the ground. So the risk of landslides is highly elevated on the Comoros. And also the islands and the remaining trees are very much more susceptible to tropical storms. So because of how the Comoros are situated, you have a few tropical storms every year that kind of pass the islands, and some of them hit, and these storms seem to become more severe and more frequent as time goes on, very likely due to climate change. So the deforestation is actually also making the entire landscape more vulnerable to effects of these tropical storms. Plus the widespread agriculture, you can see there's a lot of deforestation happening, but then also a lot of cultivating of plants, of foreign plants, invasive plants, not native plants that shouldn't be there. And they tend to also sometimes spread out into the last bits of forest. So you have a lot of introduced species and these agricultural activities happening not only on fields, but also within forests that kind of degrade the landscape even further. And because of this complex land ownership, where you have so many private individuals essentially owning most of the land, and the limited protection from the Comoros, from the government side, it's very difficult to kind of implement blanket conservation actions. So you really have to hone it down onto the individual level. So all in all, right now, it's very difficult being a flying fox on the Comoros, as you can imagine. The habitat is very limited and very degraded. However, this is where we come in, and this is also where the NGO Dahari comes in. So Dahari is a local organization based on Anjouan, and they're an conservation NGO, and Dahari means sustainable or forever in Comorian. And Dahari's been around for about 10 years, and they're working very hard to find an approach to restore natural landscape and support the local population at the same time. So kind of finding solutions that are sustainable in the long term. Now, just a quick overview, Dahari is quite a large NGO with around 60 employees, and they focus very much on protecting and managing natural resources on the Comoros, not just terrestrial, so not only on land, but also in the ocean. And then at the same time, while supporting farmers, making sure they get the access to sustainable agricultural techniques and to crop plants that are important to increase the harvest, so that not as much land is being needed, but we'll get to this in a minute. And what Dahari has also been focusing on is protecting the Livingstone flying fox population on the island. And this is where we get to, and I'll explain our plan in a few minutes. Dahari has also been responsible for monitoring the population of the Livingstone flying foxes on Anjouan for the last 10 years. And this is incredible data. So this makes me as a scientist really happy, because they've been counting all bats at the known active roosts twice a year. And they've just done the last count 2 days ago, so I'm waiting for the newest numbers, but we know that there's around 800 bats on the island of Anjouan. And this data set is now a long-term data set that helps us understand the population evolution and kind of what sort of environmental factors have an impact on the population. So this data set is there and it's being expanded as we speak, which is really exciting. They've also looked at how agriculture is affecting the habitat, especially around roost sites with tree inventories and assessing how land is used. And that sort of gave a very good idea of what could potentially impact the roost sites of Livingstone's flying foxes, given that they are on privately owned land and that is being used for agriculture. And the habitat protection scheme that Dahari came up with is based on a payments for ecosystem services program. Now that sounds complicated, but what that essentially is that private individuals, landholders are being compensated to restore natural habitat on their land. So in the context of Comoros, what that means is that if you have a roost site on your land, on your plot of land, you agree to not cut down the roost trees or cut down any other trees that are located on that plot of land, and you agree to stop any agricultural activities that could further degrade the landscape or disturb the bats on that plot of land. But in exchange, you're compensated by Dahari so that you have no loss from stopping this agriculture. And what that does is it kind of shifts the value, especially of the trees on the land, from this, okay, I can cut down the tree and get a large amount of cash in a short amount of time, or I can leave the tree standing and be compensated over the time period while it's there and the habitat is being restored. So it shifts the value of the trees from this short-term source of income to something more longer, sustainable, and valuable. And the compensation for these landholders is not necessarily financial in nature. So they are being paid every time we go to visit their fields to see the bats for research or for tourism. But essentially what happens is Dahari is supporting those individuals with crop plans. So they're being given crop plans that have higher yields and are more efficient to use on their other fields. So many times landholders have more than one plot of land. And by kind of maximizing the yield in the other fields, the loss of this plot of land for agriculture is not felt as much. Plus, there's also trainings in sustainable agriculture techniques. The landholders get to choose which trees they want to plant. And then that way they're being supported to still be able to support themselves and their family, but at the same time, restoring this plot of land around the roost sites. And hopefully at this point, helping the roost sites and the habitat there recover. As of today, 7 roost sites are currently under this co-management payment for ecosystem services program. So around a quarter of the global population of Livingstone flying foxes is both protected, if we count all the bats that inhabit those 7 roost sites. However, what we do need to do, and what Dahari is working on now, is to develop a more widespread and a more sustainable solution for this payments for ecosystem services program. So to find a solution to that is self-sustaining and that makes sense in the long run, so that the farmers can actually still use the land, the plot of land that they own, but at the same time restoring natural habitat. And how this is going to work, so this is the basic idea, is that farmers will be given support in growing forest-friendly crops. So there are some plants that you can actually grow under natural forest canopy. For example, vanilla is a very famous example for this. So landholders can actually restore the habitat, restore the area around the roost site, but they don't lose the value of the land because they can still use it as cropland, but with more forest-friendly crops that won't destroy the habitat and will not disturb the bats. And that's the long-term solution. That's the program to expand on this over the upcoming years. But one of the biggest questions we're currently facing is, where do we implement those strategies? Where do we implement the payments for ecosystem program across the island of Anjouan, or even Anjouan and Mohili? We know where the roosts are. So we know where the roost sites are, and we are keeping up to date on whether if they're changing or being abandoned or if new roost sites show up. But roost sites aren't enough. Protecting roost sites only isn't enough to kind of protect the entire species, because bats need to sleep, but also bats need to eat. So we need to figure out what other bat habitat is necessary for the species to survive. So not only where do they roost, but also where are their feeding sites? And for example, which tree species that these bats rely on. And this sort of research is something that Dahari is currently not being able to undertake on their own because of capacity logistics, but also because they want to really focus on the conservation actions on the ground and being able to implement this widespread habitat restoration on the island. And this is where BCI comes in, and where this research project comes in that I'll be working on, is that we actually want to find out where the bats go in the landscape, which areas are necessary for them to survive in the long run. And the easiest way to do this, even though it's quite complex, but the easiest way to do this is to track them with GPS tags. And it sounds pretty straightforward. You catch a bat, put a GPS tag on them, and the GPS tag records the data of where they go over a certain period of time. And you don't even have to recatch the bat to get the data off, because they're quite an ingenious part of technology that lets you download the data when you're close to the bats, but you don't have to get the tag itself anymore. So essentially, the bats will fly on, do their thing, and we can sneak up on them once in a while, download the data of where they've been, and then visualize that and see which areas and which landscape areas they've actually visited and which ones are important for the bats. And we know that this works because in 2019, we've done this already. So together with the University of Comoros, we tagged 2 bats to figure out whether these GPS tags work the way we want them to work. And it turned out to be pretty epic. I enjoyed every minute of it. This is one of these GPS tags on one of the bats, and you can see they actually have solar powered batteries, so they last for a very long time. And we managed to take data for about 10 months for one of these bats. And what it showed us was actually pretty clearly which areas in the landscape are important for the bats. And this is unfortunately not the best picture. I'm very sorry if it's difficult to see, but if you see these little red dots in the landscape, those are areas that the bats visited frequently. So those are areas where they spend a lot of time, where they came back many times over. So those are the areas that we would be interested in seeing what's there and how can we protect it. And if we overlay this data on a landscape map, so a map that shows us different types of landscape, like I did here, you can see actually these brown areas here, these are all agricultural lands. And the dark green areas are natural forest land. And the white lines around are kind of the borders of where the bats spend their time. So when I first looked at this, I thought, wait a minute, why are bats spending so much time in agricultural land? Because they can't really land on sweet potato fields. Yeah, they need trees somewhere. What's happening here? Don't they need the forest? And when I looked closer and kind of figured out which areas the bats visited many times over, we found out that actually it's those areas that are in green here. And those are these little pockets of forest that you can still find across the landscape, even just individual trees or little clumps of trees, groups of trees that the bats visited frequently and especially for feeding. So it's very, very important. It seems like it's very important to kind of preserve these specific trees that the bats use for feeding and socializing in some cases. And even though they are on this agricultural land. So this shows us that the GPS work actually can really identify which areas are important to protect in the landscape and which areas the bats need, because this is where they go. And this is the collaboration between Bat Conservation International and Dahari. So essentially, Bat Conservation will take over the research part of things and then help Daharis implement the conservation on the ground. So we are hoping to inform these conservation actions that are going to happen to protect the land, to protect the important resources and restore the habitat with the research results that we're going to get over the next couple of years. And first of all, would be to identify bat habitats. Pretty much what I just showed you, we're going to track some bats and then try and find out where they spend their time and what they do there, and really hone down into the important areas on the islands that the bats use for eating, sleeping, socializing, hanging out, if you will. The next step would be to identify feeding species. So not only where do they eat, but also what do they eat. So if you go to these feeding areas, if you can identify feeding areas, you can go to the individual trees and figure out what species those are. And then hopefully be able to kind of include those in reforestation activities so that there are more trees, more bat trees across the island. And then also something I haven't talked about a lot, but we kind of also want to be able to restore the landscape in a way that the bats are more resilient to climate change. So in case the tropical storms become more frequent and more severe, we want to be able to make sure that these bats have pockets of forest that they can go to as kind of a backup plan in case some of the roost sites or feeding sites are destroyed in the upcoming climate change induced tropical storms. I know this was a lot in a very short time. I'm just excited to be talking about it, so I tend to talk very fast. So I've kind of summarized some take-home messages for you. So first of all, we need to act quickly. Essentially, like I said before, we have very few bats left. We have about 1,200 bats on these two islands, and the habitat is just under immense pressure at the moment. So we need to really act quickly to be able to kind of stop this habitat loss and make sure that the population remains stable or even increase. The other take-home message that's important for me is kind of to understand that conservation is based on research and action. So we're marrying two components together that will hopefully produce the most effective research, most effective conservation on the ground. Because by informing what we're going to protect with research, we're able to basically really focus on the areas that the bats require. And the last take-home message is essentially what we're doing here is we're protecting a very important, very likely keystone species, and a species that is important in the ecosystem. But by doing so, we're actually restoring habitat for other fauna and flora as well. So we're restoring habitat for other birds, for reptiles, for even plants to be able to survive and build up the resilience over time. So the Livingstone flying fox acts as an umbrella species, and by protecting the Livingstone flying fox, we're actually protecting the entire Comorian ecosystem. And that was all from my side. Thank you so much for your attention. If you want to find out more, obviously have a look on Dahari's website, on Bat Conservation International's website. If you want to get in touch with me directly, it's probably easiest via Twitter these days. So feel free to message me there. I should be around. I'm not far from my laptop these days.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. We had quite a few questions coming in through the chat and through the Q&A. So I'm just going to go through them in the order that they came in. So the first question was, do flying foxes suffer from white nose syndrome?
That's a good question. They don't. So white nose syndrome is very much something that affects cave roosting bats because of the way, so white nose syndrome is essentially induced by fungus, and the fungus needs a very stable environment to grow, so it wouldn't be able to grow in these exposed tree roosts. So it's very much a cave bat problem, I'm afraid.
Great. The next question was, are Livingstone bats native or endemic? They look very similar to the black flying foxes in Australia.
They do. It's an interesting bit because the genetics aren't really clear yet, and they are definitely endemic. So they are only in the Comoros, and they originate on the Comoros, but they seem to be closely related to the Rodriguez flying fox. And I'm not entirely sure what the genetics here is to the Australian species, but you're right, they do look very similar. So I wouldn't be surprised if they weren't too far apart.
And then we had a couple of questions about the GPS trackers. So the first question was, how heavy are the logger tags? Like what percentage of their body weight?
Oh, the tags themselves are about 15 grams. And then if I put them on collars, so the collar is handmade, I have to sew the tags on, so we have about a total of 20 grams. And then there is a general rule in animal science that you shouldn't be putting on tags and collars that weigh more than 5% of an animal's body weight. And I personally try to stay very much below that. But with that rule, that means any bat I would give a GPS tracker to would have to be heavier than 400 grams. So we're having an eye on the weight, but essentially it shouldn't be more than 20 grams all in all.
And a related question was, are smaller GPS tracking devices available? And if so, are there plans to use them in the future?
There are definitely some available. I've done some research on this. Obviously, I've been in touch with many colleagues, and it turns out everyone kind of just uses what works for them in the long run. And I've used these larger ones successfully in 2019. And because of the solar panels on them, they actually give you a lot of data over a long time. And many of the smaller ones don't have solar panels on them. So there is a bit of a trade-off. I could probably use lighter tags, but it wouldn't give me as much data at the same time. So from now, we're sticking with the big trackers, but I'm always happy to hear from other researchers and hear what they're using.
And then again on weight, how much does one of these bats weigh on average?
I think the average is around half a kilo. I would say probably a bit more.
Okay. And then we had another question. Do the bats help pollinate the ylang-ylang plants? I'm sure I just messed that up pronunciation wise. Banana trees and other plants there. And if so, is that not a good reason for locals agriculture to help support the bats?
We don't know what they pollinate because we don't know what they eat. There is some basic research has been done on their diet, and they've found that they eat at least one type of flower that is not from a native tree, but we currently don't know. I don't necessarily see them pollinating banana flowers, but I'm happy to be proven otherwise. So I'm excited to find out, and I'm also excited to find out if they do pollinate or disperse the seeds of non-native trees, such as introduced fruit trees, because obviously then, yes, they would help farmers as well.
There was a question about if there's a push or thoughts regarding the PES to include ecotourism.
So there's been efforts to do that over the last 10 years as well. It's always a bit of a push and pull because it's quite difficult to get to the Comoros. But the Hari is actually working on a ecotourism program as well, so it should be included in the long-term plan. And I mean, if any of the people viewing this want to go visit the Comoros, always contact the Hari. They might be able to show you around at this point. Great.
Has there been any thought given to introducing these bats to other parts of the world?
We try to avoid introducing species to areas where they shouldn't be or they don't originate. In the case of the Livingstone's flying foxes, there's two populations currently in zoos in the UK that were meant as backup populations to be reintroduced back into the wild. So this is still something, having bats reintroduced into the wild is an option and a distant plan. But yeah, we tend to not introduce species to areas where they shouldn't be because we can never really be sure what the long-term effects would be of that.
Let's see, is this area also experiencing the red winds that are threatening 1.5 million people with starvation in southern Madagascar?
So the Comoros are much more northern, and what they're having, so essentially Comoros is protected by Madagascar a little bit when it comes to the storms and other climate change or climate impact things, because Madagascar is very much a buffer for most of these weather events. And the south of Madagascar is incredibly dry and naturally dry, and climate change has kind of just made that more severe. But the Comoros, being very north and being a bit sheltered by Madagascar, very humid. So so far I don't see there being a lot of problems with that kind of widespread drought and starvation. However, because of the deforestation that we've seen on the Comoros, a lot of the permanent rivers have actually dried up. So there is a beginning of a water shortage, and that needs to be addressed as well.
Back to the GPS tags, are the tags removed at some point, and are there any concerns with them getting caught on plants, etc.?
That's a really good question. Something that we all have a headache about when you work with flying foxes and collars and tags, you want to make sure to make it as safe as possible. in my case, because I hand make those collars, I ensure that there's a weak link in them that breaks apart after a few months. And it has worked very well in the past. So the collars open up by themselves and fall off the flying fox after about half a year or so. And so this is kind of my safeguard to be able to know for sure that the tags and the collars will be off the bat after some time. But yeah, of course, you always think about these things. And the other alternative would be to glue the tags directly onto the bats with like skin adhesive, but that way the tags don't normally tend to stay on very long. They only stay on for about a week maximum, and it's a bit risky losing the tags in the vegetation after only a week if you could get longer term data.
Okay, I'm going to butcher this pronunciation, I'm sure. But there's a question about, is there any evidence of competition with Pteropus seychellensis on the islands?
You didn't butcher it, it was fine. Interestingly enough, there's been some behavior studies on this, and it seems like if a Seychellensis fruit bat and a Livingstone fruit bat are on the same tree and fighting for the same resource, the Livingstone will win, likely because it's larger and more ferocious. So in a one-on-one competition, many times actually the Seychellensis will be displaced by the Livingstones. However, it seems like they have found a way to kind of divide the islands up between them. So Seychellensis is very widespread. You can find it on all the Comorian islands. It's a bit of a smaller flying fox, and they seem to like the lower elevations more. So Livingstone flying foxes actually stay on the higher elevations. This is where their roost sites are. This is where the feeding sites are, apparently. And the Seychellensis, they occur all the way, like from the mid elevations down to the sea level. And they seem to just live off any odd fruit tree that they can find. So there isn't as much natural competition between the two flying foxes. But if they do compete for a resource, the Livingstones normally win. Good for them.
What is the general attitude toward these bats in the Comoros? Do you know if people use them as bushmeat?
They're not being eaten, they're not being hunted. So I have seen kids throw stones at Seychellensis bats in the cities, but generally they're left alone, and the Livingstones as well. And Comorian people are very aware of the ecosystem and ecosystem functions. So telling them that the bat disperses seeds, yes, they know that. But the bats generally are being left alone, and they're not being hunted or eaten.
Okay. Another question about are people migrating? I'm not sure if that's to or away from.
That's a good question. I'm not entirely sure to what extent. There's always a push for many people to migrate to Mayotte, which is the fourth Comorian island, geographically speaking, but it still belongs to France. So there might be a general push to kind of migrate to away from the Comoros into France, but honestly, I have no in-depth knowledge on that.
Okay. There's a question about have the charities tried engaging with perfume manufacturers?
That's a complicated topic because many times the perfume manufacturers don't really, so they're not the ones producing the oils on the country. There's a supply chain in between. So this would require quite in-depth detailed work to kind of figure out who can work with whom. So I'm not entirely sure how that would work at this point.
Okay. There's a question about if there's any feedback loops affecting people, crops, or food supply.
Feedback loops in terms of?
Maybe I'll let Teresa, who asked that, add a little more context there. And we'll go to the next question. Do they have a breeding program for these flying foxes in captivity?
Yeah, so the two zoos currently that have the Livingstones in captivity for a specific conservation-based breeding program are Jersey's Durrell Zoo in Jersey and Bristol Zoo, and both of them are in the UK.
Okay, and on the feedback loops, Teresa put about Madagascar.
I'm sorry, I don't think I understand the question.
Teresa, if you could rephrase that, maybe that would be helpful. And I'll go on to the next question. Is there a relationship between insecticides and phosphorus volcanic vapors and nuclear failures in far lands? Petrifying wood could impact these life cellular supports. Should be enough, only increased temperature on bat soils. Is that a problem?
That's good. So I've been thinking about these sorts of things for the past couple of years, especially insecticides and pesticides that are being used widespread on the island. We honestly don't know anything about it yet. We don't know how this could and would and if it affects the bats, but it is on my radar to kind of, if there's an opening and a possibility to look into this, I personally would be really interested in it.
Okay. The questions keep coming in. So is the population large enough that interbreeding is not a concern? And also, do the bats on the other island face the same challenges? And also, do the bats travel between islands?
Those are excellent questions. So we just talked about this with a colleague of mine last week who did genetics on the bat for the captive bats. And she seems to be not so concerned about interbreeding or inbreeding, essentially because these island animals are normally very resilient to inbreeding. So they can deal with a bit of inbreeding over a bunch of generations. We don't really know whether the bats are migrating between the islands. It is a possible distance for them to cover. However, it looks like genetically they are not interbreeding. So it seems we have two breeding populations. One is on Anjouan, one on Moheli. But it's obviously not entirely sure whether, maybe some individuals make the trip once in a while, but genetically it seems like we have two different breeding populations in the wild.
Okay, let's see, is there any interspecific competition with flying foxes in natural habitat which affects the bat's survival?
We don't know that yet. That's a good question. For example, on Mauritius, the bats and the monkeys compete directly, but we have the only introduced primate on the Comoros are the lemurs. So they might be competing with the lemurs, but we don't really know that yet. Might be able to find that out.
How do the fox bats fit into their larger ecology and ecosystem?
Good question. Essentially, flying foxes are often very important pollinators and seed dispersers for plants that have specialized on flying foxes. So you've got actually quite a few fruit trees, commercially available fruits that are dependent on flying foxes, like durian, for example. So, but even without these commercially available fruits, in an ecosystem, a flying fox will likely be the one pollinating your tree and then dispersing the seeds so another new tree can grow. So that's their major role in the ecosystem. But I'm sure they have multiple minor ones as well.
Let's see. Do these foxes pollinate any fruit trees?
We don't know. I'm sure they do. I'm assuming they do, but we don't know which ones yet. So I'm hoping that in 1-2 years, I have a very better idea of that, and we can do another webinar, and they can tell you all about the fruit trees that these bats pollinate.
Why are there no Livingstones on Grand Comore?
It's a good question. I'm not entirely sure. It might have something to do with the habitat there. Grand Comore is basically an active volcano. So it might not be the most ideal habitat for them. It's not as steep and mountainy as the other two islands, but I personally am not entirely sure why there are no flying foxes or no Livingstone flying foxes on Grand Comore, because you have a lot of Seychellensis flying foxes.
Let's see, would it help to try to reduce the number of stills by having co-ops type stills?
Okay, I don't know what stills are.
Barbara, if you wouldn't mind elaborating. Let's see, do the bats on the other islands face the same challenges?
So essentially, Anjouan and Moheli have slightly different challenges. The most of the work I presented today was for Anjouan. Moheli has established a very large national park in the center of the island that covers a lot, not all, but a lot of the roosts that we know of on Moheli. So on paper, the bats are more protected there. But however, the last time we went there, we saw that a lot of agricultural activity had kind of sprung up in the national park. So there's this, it's questionable how well they are protected there, but it would probably require a slightly different approach than on Anjouan, where all the roosts and all the feeding sites that we know of so far are on private land.
Okay. Have you published papers on Livingstones, and if so, where can I access them?
So we've published the GPS study on a short paper in Oryx, the conservation journal. So that's out there, and I think it's open access as well.
Okay. How many bat species coexist in the region?
I think so. This is my numbers brain now. I think so. We've got 3 fruit bats. We've got the Livingstone's flying fox, we've got the Seychellensis flying fox, and we've got the Comoros rosette. Those are definitely on Anjouan. And then you have at least 5 small bats, insectivorous bat species, if not 9 in total over the 3 islands. So there's quite a few, but there's very little work that's been done on them.
All right, let's see. I'm going back to the stills. The stills question was about the stills where the flowers are reduced to oils, like for the different oils of perfume or
yes, no, perfect. Barbara, good observation. Actually, many of them are co-op distilleries. So many of them actually do take the flowers from multiple plantations, but there's still quite a lot.
You mentioned introduced species. What are these?
Introduced species are species that shouldn't be on the Comoros that often have been introduced by humans. So for example, fruit trees that wouldn't naturally grow there, but humans could benefit of. You very often have that scenario where somebody plants, I don't know, let's say a mango tree, even though mango trees shouldn't have grown there. So this is an introduced species. They're not always negative, but they didn't originate in the Comoros.
See, so I've got a number of things from Teresa on the feedback loops affecting people, crops, and food supplies. So she's talking about putting stress on food supplies, imported goods. Okay. Okay.
So essentially the idea is, or the question is whether the starving Madagascar population is migrating to the Comoros. I mean, again, I'm not an expert on population dynamics in this area, but what I've seen so far is the Comoros is very expensive and difficult to migrate to, or not difficult, but I've not been made aware of an influx of Madagascar population being able to actually make the trip to the Comoros. But again, I'm not an expert on population dynamics there, so there might be more to it than I'm saying.
And the bats help fertilize the surrounding areas. Is that true? Likely
true.
What percentage of the roosts are in Natringu National Park, and are those roosts endangered?
Mount Tringy is on Comoros. Oh no, it's the other one. Sorry, I need to double check that. Because there's one national park that sounds similar to the other. So if it's the national park on Grand Comore, then no, we have no roosts there because there are no bats on Grand Comore. The only national park, now there's another national park that's just been established on Anjouan, and I think there's 7 roosts in that national park. And on Moheli, I think there's most of them, if not all, are on in the Moheli National Park. Yeah.
All right, we are just about out of time. So if anybody has any last questions they want to ask. Someone asked, how did you become interested in these bats, and to tell us more about yourself?
Essentially, so I did my PhD on lemurs on Madagascar, and then I started working for Dahari, and Dahari is focusing on these bats. So I actually didn't know how cool bats were until I started working on them. But I was excited because the lemurs I had worked on were nocturnal. They was quite small, so I thought, you know, I can deal with animals that are up at night. And when Dahari kind of said, oh, we want to be focusing on these bats, I was really excited. But then I got more into bats, and I realized how incredible these animals are just across the board. And I learned more about them. I learned more about, you know, handling them, working with them, their biology, and it just got me hooked on bats in general. So the Livingstone's flying foxes for me are kind of the pinnacle of bats because they are so amazing. But in general, it just working with them just made me excited for any bat out there.
Does Dahari work with microbats as well?
Not now, no.
We have the question, what do bats make of people?
I mean, the first person to find that out, please tell me. I would like to know that too.
What resources and books do you recommend for furthering our interest in bats?
Wow, I would say go to Bat Conservation International's website and check out the resources, and also go to the Bat Conservation Trust's website in the UK. They have amazing resources there as well. Am I allowed to kind of peddle other organizations, Karen?
Sure. We all want to save bats here.
Yeah, that's kind of the idea, is that we're all saving bats together. But essentially, Bat Conservation International has resources, the Bat Conservation Trust has resources, and do use social media. We do hang out on Twitter a lot and talk about bats, mainly to ourselves. I don't know how many people are actually listening, but we do end up chatting a lot about bats on social media.
All right, I think we've made it through all the questions. Those were such wonderful questions from folks around the world. So thanks again. Thank you, Dr. Mandl, and thank you everyone for joining us. As you might know, we are currently raising funds so we can go to work to help protect this beautiful bat. And I know many of you have supported our effort to save the Livingstone's fruit bat already, but if you haven't, I hope you will. You can go to batcon.org/Livingstones and make a donation there. We hope that you guys will help us make this conservation work possible. Thank you again, everybody, for joining us. Until next time.
Thank you so much. That was fun.